Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Brian Trippett. I am known in social media circles as the Front Porch Conservative. I am sometimes known as the Beau in the Chapeau. Sometimes I'm called the Fine Fella in the Fedora, and a few other names that I can mention because this is a family friendly show, but we'll leave those aside for a moment. Welcome to the very first session in 2024 of Chattin on the Porch. A nice little discussion where we bring on some guests and talk about current events that are going on right now. We are on YouTube, we're on Rumble, we're on Twitter. So if you're out there anywhere in social media and you've got friends that need to hear this, send them a message right now. Send out a tweet, send out a Gettr, send out a Truth Social, whatever it may be, and let them know this is the place they need to be tonight. So it's finally here, 2024, the year that fills us with dread and excitement if you are a political junkie. And to that end, my first guest tonight is someone I'm bringing on because I want to try as much as I possibly can to share information as it relates to the upcoming Iowa caucus. And I think the gentleman that I'm about to bring on, let me rephrase that. I know the gentleman I'm about to bring on is exceedingly qualified to be able to speak to the nuts and bolts that is the first in the nation political event. Tim Hagle is a political science professor at the University of Iowa, where he teaches and studies American politics, judicial behavior, and public administration. Since coming to Iowa in 1988, he's been a volunteer, participant, and critical observer of the Iowa caucuses. Professor Hagle is the author of two different books. The first, Riding the Caucus Roller Coaster, The Ups and Downs of the Republican Race to Win the 2012 Iowa Caucuses, and Riding the Roller Coaster 2020, the Democrat race to win the Iowa caucuses. He is a frequent commenter on Iowa politics for state, national, and international media outlets, and you can find him on social media on Twitter, where his username is @ProfHagle. With that, I bring you Tim Hagle. Professor Hagle, welcome to the Electronic Front Porch.
Thanks. Good to be with you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It is a pleasure to have you here tonight. So, okay, on behalf of everybody on my Electronic Front Porch, and for those who are going to see this later on, and you know you will, what's the weather like out there right now? How are you guys surviving? What's going on?
Well, we managed to get our first really big snowstorm, and bigger than we had, I think, all last year. It's right now where I'm at here in Iowa City. I think we've got at least over 10 inches, perhaps even closing in on 12. I know other places have gotten something similar. So we're really digging out this time. I basically made a joke on Twitter that with all of the visiting media, we wanted to give them the full Iowa experience, and they're certainly getting it today.
Oh, that's great. That is fantastic. Okay, I know our time is limited, so let's just jump right on in. Because if nothing else, after this is all over with, you got to go dig out some snow. So let's just dive right into it. I want to thank you for coming on, and I want to get first. Let's talk about what is a caucus. Now, let me set this up by doing it this way. I live in West Virginia. We have a primary. When my primary date comes up, I go to my polling place. I present my driver's license or my voter identification card. They match me in the books. They hand me a ballot. I go into a booth. Da 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 da. I put my choices down. Ballot is registered. I walk out. I'm done. But a caucus is a whole different political animal. So, for folks who've heard the term, because Lord knows we've been hearing it for months on end now, and understandably so, it is the first in the nation political event. But for those who aren't familiar with a caucus, like let's say, for example, let's say I lived in Des Moines, Iowa, and I'm a Republican, and I find out that my caucus place is at the gymnasium for the First Baptist Church of Des Moines. If I walked into that gym on caucus night, January 15th, how does a caucus work for someone like me?
Well, let me back up just a little bit here before we get to the point
Okay.
where you go into the gymnasium. And the difference between a main difference between a caucus and a primary is, as you suggested, that you have to show up. Now, with the primary, of course, you have the opportunity to vote. If you're going to vote on election day, it's usually sometime from early in the morning till late in the evening. Or many states will have the opportunity to early and absentee vote. And so you have a lot more variability there, or choices in terms of when you can actually cast your ballot. That's not the case with the caucus. With the caucus, as you were suggesting, you basically have to know where your precinct caucus is, because it's not going to be the same place that you vote usually. And then you also have to show up. So there's no absentee, no early voting kind of a thing. And so that's really the key difference. And it's one of the reasons why attendance at caucuses is below that of even primaries. So in terms of the caucuses, you go in and you do essentially the same thing that you would do at a primary, where you're going to be checked off in a book. In other words, you mentioned Republican, so are you a registered Republican in that precinct, which is a geographical district, basically? So are you a registered voter, Republican voter in that particular district? If not, you can change your voter registration that night. So one of the things that often helps parties build their numbers is that a number of independents in Iowa, which we actually call no party voters, they can change their voter registration that night if they want to caucus for one candidate or another. But once you get checked in, then basically there's some preliminary stuff to get the meeting started. And then for the Republicans, it's a fairly straightforward process where you'll have, again, that preliminary business sorts of things to pick a permanent chair for the meeting, to basically just run the meeting. And then you'll have the representatives of the various campaigns will have signed in, and they'll give maybe a 3 to 5 minute speech on behalf of their candidate. And then you just vote. And then once the vote's taken place, and sometimes it's an official ballot that's printed up, sometimes it's just a slip of paper, depending on how big the precinct is, how many people are there. And then they get tallied up. And this year it's being reported on a website that they're testing to make sure it's going to work properly. The last 2 cycles, Republicans used a phone app, and that worked pretty well too, but there were a few problems. So they switched to something on the website. And so then it gets sent in. And then at that point, once the vote is confirmed for that precinct, then you go on to other business. And that's the other sort of difference with the caucuses, of course, that you have the business side of things, which basically means that you're selecting people to the county central committee for the Republicans, and also delegates to the county convention. So there are votes and things like that. And then you can also start the platform process at the ground level too. And so that's basically what a caucus is. And I should mention too that Iowa does have a primary. It's just that on the Iowa primary, the presidential preference is not part of it, because that's taken care of in the caucuses.
Okay. So it's almost like a combination of a town meeting with a town crier, because you've got people giving a 3 and 5 minute speech, and a political business meeting, if you get right down to it. I mean, on so many levels, it's just fundamentally, it's a very unique animal. So let me run this past you, and this I'm very curious about. You've studied the Iowa caucus for years now. How is it that Iowa came to have its first in the nation status, and how has it managed to maintain it? Because I can remember, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, I want to say like the mid 96. I think Louisiana tried to slip their caucus in ahead of the Iowa caucus, if I remember right. But Iowa, for years now, has maintained that first in the nation status. How have they managed to do it, and what is the history behind the caucus itself? How did this unique political animal come about in American politics?
So part of the story, as I understand it, it was this, some of this was even before my time here in Iowa, that after the disaster of the Democratic Convention in 1968, people may remember all of the protests or heard about the protests, Chicago 7 and all of that, that the Iowa Democrats decided they wanted to do something different. So they decided that they would hold a caucus and have it ahead of the New Hampshire primary. Now, in case your viewers aren't aware of it, New Hampshire has a law, and has had a law for over 100 years at this point, that says that their primary is the first presidential primary in the selection process, in the nomination process for the parties. So they get to go first as a primary. So if the Iowa Democrats wanted to go ahead of them, they had to do it as a caucus rather than a primary. And so that's how they got ahead of New Hampshire. New Hampshire's basically maybe not thrilled with it, but said, okay, we can, live with it, kind of a thing. And then in 1976, the Republicans did the same thing. And so ever since then, Republicans and Democrats have had the caucus on the same date. Democrats are doing something a little bit different this time. We could talk about that perhaps too. But in terms of then 1976, where Democrats and Republicans were doing the same thing, what made the caucuses important that year was that this little known Southern governor named Jimmy Carter decided that he was going to participate in the Iowa caucuses. And that's understandable. Again, this is before the internet, before all social media sorts of things. And so he needed some way to basically get his name out there, get his name recognition, become more known within the Democratic Party. And so as a result, he came up here, and among the candidates, he won the Iowa caucuses. And then, of course, because he went on and got a lot of momentum from that and got a lot of publicity from that, he got the nomination and then, of course, won in the general election. Well, as a result, then in 1980, we started to have more people coming, more candidates coming to Iowa, and it sort of grew from there. Now, in terms of the sort of the criticisms, you're right, it's been a while, and Iowa and New Hampshire have been under criticisms for a number of cycles. It's one of the things that I spend a lot of time doing is basically defending the Iowa caucuses and explaining them to people, explaining the value of having a small rural agricultural state like Iowa be first in the nation, and the advantages to both the voters and the candidates for doing that. And basically, Iowa and New Hampshire have worked together because, again, New Hampshire has had a lot of similar criticisms. And so by working together and occasionally having candidates who won the presidency that won Iowa and were willing to then defend the Iowa caucuses. So people like George W. Bush and Barack Obama are two good examples of that. So they basically then would say, yes, we're comfortable with having Iowa and New Hampshire be the first two states. Well, things then changed this year, in part because Joe Biden decided he didn't like the Iowa caucuses. Part of the reason for that was he finished fourth here and fifth in New Hampshire, and it was only South Carolina that saved his campaign. And so as a result, he decided to reward South Carolina. They usually talk about, for the Democrats, they usually talk about the fact that both Iowa and New Hampshire are insufficiently diverse, meaning we're too white. And that's sort of one of the things that they tend to emphasize. And it's always struck me as kind of odd to be that dismissive of the minority folks that we do have in Iowa and that there are in New Hampshire as well. But be that as it may, that was one of the reasons why they decided to switch up and Democrats decided to switch it up and kick Iowa out of the early states. So for them, technically, Democrats are still having a caucus here, but only doing the party business, the delegates and the people on the Central Committee. As far as the presidential preference side of things goes, they're doing a mail-in ballot kind of thing. And so right now, Democrats can request a ballot. They'll be sent out later next month and then tabulated and results released on Super Tuesday, which means they'll basically be lost in the results of all the other states and pretty much meaningless at that point. But Republicans, at least so far, this cycle and hopefully beyond, are adhering to the traditional Iowa First Caucus procedures.
So let me ask you a question related to what the Biden administration did as far as switching up the order. I mean, yes, Democrats are doing, at least for the presidential ballot, they're doing a mail-in ballot, and they're having their vote measured and weighed. I get that, but do you hear any feedback from like folks who are not necessarily highly partisan Democrats? Daggone it, I can't believe they did this. I can't believe they took away, even among the Democrats, our first, and we should be at the first. Forget South Carolina. We've been doing this since 1976. By golly, we ought to be first. Are you hearing this from anybody? And if you do, what do you think what does it feed into in November?
Yeah. The funny thing about that is that New Hampshire Democrats fought hard. New Hampshire was also kicked out of the first in the nation status, but they said, no way, we've got a state law that says we go first and we're going to continue to adhere to that. And so they decided to do so. So there's some question as to how people campaigning in New Hampshire and what's going to happen there on the Democrat side, because it's not a non-conforming event. And so even Biden isn't even apparently going to be on the ballot there. So it's just going to be Dean Phillips and maybe Marianne Williamson. We'll see if anybody else is on. And so they decided in New Hampshire, the Democrats to fight hard to keep their first in the nation status. Iowa Democrats didn't. And that's been sort of a complaint from some people. Probably some Democrats, although not many Democrats seem to be willing to really speak out that much against it. Part of it has to do with they bought into some of the Democratic National Committee's DNC's idea that, well, Iowa's too small, too rural, too old, too white, and so forth. But also a number of Democrats in Iowa were concerned about the process. Now, unlike Republicans, where, as I described before, basically once they get checked in, hear a few speeches, they vote, and then they can leave if they want to, and only the people interested in the party business stay. With Democrats, it was this whole complex thing where they move around the room. They have viability groups. You have to get 15% for your candidate, or it's not viable,
Yeah,
and you have to pick a
that.
second choice. And it's understandable to want to do that. But in a lot of the larger precincts, like those here in my county, which is heavily Democratic in terms of the voter registration, that basically it ended up where it would take hours before you could even get a result. And then
Right.
there was, instead of releasing the vote, which they finally did in 2020, but before that, they've always had to have it converted into what were called state delegate equivalents. So there was mathematics involved and arithmetic, and a lot of people weren't trained, and there was confusion. So again, a lot of the people in some of the precincts that where this was happening were just so disgusted with it that they wanted to go to a primary, figuring that would make it easy. And I should mention one other thing about that too, is that again, another difference between a primary and a caucus. A primary is run by the state. The caucuses are run by the parties and often by volunteers. So if you happen to be somebody who's initially a temporary chair for a precinct, you're not getting paid for that. That's a volunteer position. And so you get some training as to how to do it. There's a script that you can follow, and it's fairly easy, but sometimes it can get a little confusing for some folks if they haven't done it before, or they haven't had any experience with it. And so it basically puts more pressure on these folks. Sometimes mistakes happen. Republicans had a big mistake in 2012. Democrats had real big oopsie moments in 16 and 20. Essentially it's a matter of, for the Democrats, they just said, okay, well, let's go with a primary, but they couldn't do that. And so they went with this mail-in thing, figuring that that would be easier to handle. We'll see. I think there are going to be some logistical problems with that. And as I said,
Yeah.
that it's all going to be lost in the shuffle. But then to the point that you made is that I think that in fact, we are going to see some backlash to that, because one of the things that often happens is that you get a number of no party voters, the independents here in Iowa, that want to participate in one caucus or the other. Now, again, because the Democrats have an incumbent, there's not a whole lot of action going on there. But when it comes to the general election, I'm sure Republicans are going to be reminding Democrats and no party voters, saying, hey, the Democrats basically abandoned Iowa. Democrats at this point think that Iowa is a red state. I'll argue that we're still a purple state, but at least
I'll
right
agree
now
with
on
that.
the red side of purple.
I'll agree with that. There's a pollster out there, and I don't know if you ever heard of him. His name is Rich Barris, and he's argued that for years. He's like, for Republicans out there that are thinking that you've got Iowa locked in for the next few years, don't count on it. There's like 15, 16 different swing counties in Iowa by itself that have gone back and forth over the years. So there's no guarantee that post-Trump that Iowa remains a Republican state, but we'll move on from there. If you're just joining us, my name is Brian Trippett. I'm the Front Porch Conservative. This is Professor Tim Hagle from the University of Iowa, who has been studying the Iowa caucus for years. I want to put up one question that came in from the audience and get your take on this. Blue Streamer asks, can third party or independent candidates host a caucus as well? I mean, for example, the Libertarian Party of Iowa, do they have to host a caucus on the 15th of January, or could they pick another date and say, okay, we're going to have our caucus on this date and we go from there, or any other party for that matter?
That's an interesting question. I should mention that in Iowa, there are officially usually just the two main parties, Democrats and
Okay.
Republicans. If a candidate gets 2% in a general election, so that could either be a presidential election year or a midterm election year where the governor's on the ballot. If the governor candidate or the presidential candidate for say, Libertarian or Green parties, if they get 2%, then that party becomes official. And that's happened a couple of times. In 2000, the Green Party became official. I think it was 2012. I'd have to go back and look at it. Libertarians did. But usually then they don't get 2% in the next midterm election because they don't have a gubernatorial
Sure.
candidate that's going to get that much. And so they lose it again. One thing that's different this time is that because of what was going on in the 2022 elections here, where the Democrats put up a really weak candidate against Governor Kim Reynolds, that you had a fair number of people then vote for the Libertarian candidate. And so the Libertarian Party actually got official status. And now this is the first time, at least since I've been looking at this stuff for the last 20, 25 years, that you have a third party that's actually official for a presidential election. So technically, the Libertarian Party can, and I think they are holding caucuses. We haven't heard too much about it. I think there's one candidate I know that has been in Iowa running. I can't remember the fellow's name, but basically they, I think, are going to have their caucuses on the same day. But that's what I'm not sure of, because again, usually it had been that both parties go at the same time, Democrats and Republicans. We've never really had the situation where there was a third party. And if you're an independent, you don't really have a caucus. You just sort of can campaign and get on the ballot in another way. Basically, you get your name on the ballot. And certainly on the presidential ballot, there are candidates for a lot of parties that are on the ballot that aren't official in Iowa and can not necessarily have caucuses. So like the Communist Party and the Social Worker Party, all that kind of stuff, that they basically can get on the ballot other ways rather than through some sort of caucus process.
Okay. Okay. So I'm going to put something up on screen, and I want to get your take on this, because I heard this number the other day, and this absolutely blew my mind. This is from NBC News. Republicans have spent over $100 million in Iowa on TV ads, with more to come. And if we went a little further into the article, they're estimating $100 million has been spent already, with another maybe $7.5, $8 million between the time this article was written, which was exactly 1 week ago, to the 15th of January. So having shown you this, let me set up something. Oh, I keep doing that. Sorry, I'm boomering already. Yeah, the show is so well technically run. Anyway, Iowa is much like its counterpart New Hampshire in that, and I lived in the Midwest for a little while. I lived out in Illinois for about 6 years in the 90s. And Iowa is fantastic for one of the last places in America for retail campaigning. I mean, if you want to get the vote of an Iowa voter, regardless of which party, by George, you better show up. You better look them in the eye, shake their hand, and they want to get to know you. Daggone it, they want to have a conversation with you. They want to say, "Hey, this guy came to my town," or they see the weekly little newspaper, right? That comes out on Saturday. $100 million. I'm sure that the sales reps at the TV stations are very happy. If nothing else, they probably padded their kids' college funds with the money they've made on commission. But to the average Iowa voter, is $100 million all that effective to try to get their vote? Or is it still an issue of, I'm showing up at the fair, I'm showing up for this particular thing or this particular institution in this county? I mean, 99 counties in the state of Iowa. DeSantis, I think, if I remember correctly, has done a tour. I think Vivek Ramaswamy has done like 2 tours of every county in the state. What does $100 million get you in Iowa?
Well, it's a combination of things. That you're right that still in Iowa, we like to see the retail politics. We like to see people go to, excuse me, all of these various places. If you hit all 99 counties, Republicans call that in Iowa, the full Grassley, because our Senator Grassley, who's a Republican, visits each of the 99 counties every year. And that's a good way for him to stay in touch with the voters. And that's why he's the most popular politician in the state.
Yep.
But for candidates running for president, it's also good for them to do that, because, again, it gets them away from sort of the population centers, Des Moines and places like Cedar Rapids in Lynn County, or even where I'm at in Johnson County. And you get to hear what the people in the more rural areas are thinking about the issues. And, you get that sort of diverse opinion of what's going on here, what's going on in the Northeast, the Southwest, whatever it happens to be part of the state. And there are going to be some variations there, even though they're all Iowans and they have certain issues in common. So that retail politics thing is important. And in fact, in DeSantis's town hall tonight that I was watching, that he emphasized that, as he often does on some of his stops, where he says, look, I've done the work. I've been to all these counties. I've listened to Iowans across the state. I can understand the issues that are important to you folks, and I'm willing to work for them. So that's his message. And Vivek does something similar. Haley's a little bit behind. She's got some additional help with AFP Action endorsement and put some resources behind it. So we'd like to have that, but the advertising is important too, because as much as Iowans are very good at going out and visiting and listening to the candidates wherever they happen to be speaking, a town hall, a community center, wherever it happens to be, that sometimes they don't have that opportunity, or they can't get to it, or the candidates haven't come someplace near, or the timing's bad, whatever it is. So what the advertising often does is reminds them about talking points or particular points of interest, issues that are important to a particular candidate. And one of the things that we've seen in particular this cycle is, since Trump runs a different type of campaign, he doesn't do the retail politics the same way. He's got the rally effect. And that's
Sure.
partly because, A, he's got much higher name recognition, and he had that back in 2016. But even B, that he's the former president. So everybody knows sort of what he does. And as a former president, if you were an incumbent, you don't tend to do the same type of retail politics anyway. And that's not Trump's style. And that's fine. But that also means that he's reaching people more in terms of that advertising. And a lot of it was attack advertising to DeSantis. And there were some reports that a lot of the ads, more ads were spent attacking DeSantis than attacking Trump and Biden combined, which sort of surprised me. But, again, it's the primary of the caucuses for us, so it's still early. We'll see lots more attack ads for Trump and Biden later, especially if Trump's the nominee. So it's a combination of things that we still like to see the retail politics. We like to see people do the work. Now, that doesn't guarantee that they're going to be successful, but if they don't do the work, they're probably not going to be successful. It's sort of a necessary but not sufficient condition.
No, absolutely. Now, let me ask you something that everybody talks about, and I'm really curious to find out how much of an effect it has for a candidate, and who you think's got the best one of these right now. The word ground game. If the idea is you can't vote absentee, you can't vote early, you've got to show up for this thing, then it's sort of incumbent upon the candidate. Okay, I got to make sure I've got a way to get my people to my caucus who have said, daggone it, I like you, and I'm going to vote for you if I go to the caucus. Now, notice the words, if I go to the caucus. So, how important is the ground game for these candidates right now? And in your opinion, who's got the best ground game from everything you've seen?
Yeah. So you're exactly right about the ground game. And that's, again, the thing about the caucus, where, again, with the primary, you've got choices to vote all day long, even if you're just going to vote on election day, or you've got early voting, absentee voting choices. With a caucus, you got to be there that night. There's no absentee aspect to it. Now, the Democrats tried to do something like that in 2020, didn't work out really well. And so, again, that's why they went to the mail in ballot. But for the Republicans, the traditional method, you got to show up. But you can also understand that somebody that maybe comes home from a hard day at work, is tired, doesn't want to go out again.
Sure.
It's January, in this case, 15th. It's going to be cold. Apparently, the forecast is for -2 Fahrenheit.
Ugh.
So some people don't want to go out when it's like that. You can't find a babysitter for the kids, or the kids are being ornery, or whatever it is, that sometimes you got reasons for not wanting to go out again to a caucus. So that's why you have to have your supporters, you have to have your ground game such that your supporters are going to be sufficiently energized, sufficiently interested, that, by golly, they're going to go out to that caucus no matter what, because they really are enthused with this particular candidate. Now, Donald Trump has a pretty solid, pretty locked in base, and the folks that are going to vote for him, and some of them vote for him and it's nobody else, even in sort of the general, if
Yeah.
somebody else were to get the nomination. It's not necessarily a good thing for the Republican Party, but again,
No.
that's sort of where Trump is, and we'll see what happens there. But there are probably some Trump supporters that maybe are a little more marginal. And so those are the folks where, if you have a good ground game, if you're calling up people saying, hey, here's your precinct location, make sure you show up. And also, if you have precinct captains, now there are some 1,700 precincts across the state of Iowa. And if you have a precinct captain, now, to some extent, the person only really has to show up on caucus night, give that speech maybe, and maybe talk to some people at the particular precinct caucus. But a really energetic precinct captain, one who's been picked well in advance, will be working his or her precinct. So that means door knocking, phone calling, follow-up contacts, maybe helping to organize events, and doing a lot of things to keep that energy level up. And so, as a result, we'll see those results on caucus night. Who had the better ground game? Well, Trump didn't have much of a ground game in 2016, which is one of the reasons why he lost to Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz had a better ground game, made sure he's got his supporters out, ended up winning the caucuses. Trump's organization seems to have understood that. And even though Trump's not doing the traditional rally or traditional rallies, or he's doing rallies, but he's not doing a traditional caucus retail politics approach. but they still understood they've got to up their ground game. So they've been working on getting the precinct captains. They've been having caucus trainings. And so it still seems to be a little behind DeSantis. DeSantis got on this pretty early, but Trump's going to be, seems to be okay. We'll see how it goes, especially given the weather and the cold and so forth. DeSantis folks have been working hard. They've got precinct captains lined up. Quite a few, I think, if not in all of the precincts, at least they've got a number high enough to cover all the precincts. We'll see how that works out too. But if they're doing the calling, if they're doing the door knocking and so forth, they should have a pretty good turnout. Haley started a little bit slow, but is trying to catch up at this point. She's getting some buzz, not just in New Hampshire, but even here in Iowa a little bit. So she may do okay, but I think maybe some of her support might be a little bit more marginal than that of Trump or DeSantis. Christie hasn't been campaigning here, so even though he's polling at around 4%, my guess is that more of his supporters would probably just say, meh, he's not going to win, so why bother? And the same is kind of true for Ramaswamy, although he does energize the younger voters a little bit more because he is younger and sort of speaks to them to a certain extent. So if they're willing to come out, one sort of problem we have along those lines is that, at least here at the University of Iowa, our classes don't start until Tuesday, the day after the caucuses. So if the students are back in town, which most of them probably should be for Monday the 15th, they might caucus, but it's often hard to get students to caucus because they're unfamiliar with the process. A lot of our students are out of state, so they would have to be re-registered here, which they can do as a resident in Iowa, even though they may be an out-of-state student, that if they've been sufficiently organized. But I haven't really seen as much organization on campus as we usually do in an open caucus.
Okay. Well, my name is Brian Trippett. If you just happen to be stopping in, I'm the Front Porch Conservative. I'm joined by Professor Tim Hagle from the University of Iowa. I want to go into something that's a unique historical, I hate to use this word because it's not totally accurate, anomaly as it relates to the Iowa caucus. I want to run something up here, and not that I'm the best scholar in the world, but I can read a chart. These are the winners of the Iowa caucus and the New Hampshire primary going back to 1976 to present. And I'm going to see if I can enlarge this just for everyone's benefit, although my techie skills are a little rough. But anyway, I think I can still enlarge this. Hang on. As I'm doing that, the anomaly that people point to when it comes to the Iowa caucus is this. Okay, somebody wins the Iowa caucus, but that's not necessarily a guarantee they go on to win New Hampshire. I mean, for example, you had 1988, you had Bob Dole wins Iowa, George Herbert Walker Bush beats him in New Hampshire. Go down to 96, Dole wins in Iowa, Buchanan wins in New Hampshire, and so on. How much of an effect or much of a bounce? Let's say, for example, that the polls are right and that former President Trump goes on to win handily in Iowa by a healthy percentage. Now, I'm not saying he will, but let's just say he does. How much of a bounce does that give him going into New Hampshire? Or is he going to be, could he potentially, even though he's former president, could he potentially be up for the New Hampshire curse?
Yeah, this Nikki Haley got into some trouble recently because she was telling a New Hampshire audience that, after Iowa does its thing, that New Hampshire will correct them. And so that kind of gets at that particular point. She got a little bit of criticism here in Iowa for that particular comment, no surprise. So the thing is that, yeah, the two states, even though we're, both Republican Party, when you're talking about these types of this type of caucus, that there are differences. And there are even differences among Republicans here in Iowa. There are a couple of counties like the one that I'm in, the Republicans seem to be more liberal than the Republicans, say, in the northwest part of the state, which is heavily Republican, very evangelical, and more conservative. So you see those kinds of differences even among the states, and that's no big surprise. One of the things that sometimes New Hampshire will say is that, well, hey, we pick presidents. Well, okay, but you're also picking a president after Iowa's had its say. So you get a chance to see what Iowa's going to do. And we don't say here in Iowa that we're the kingmaker. What we say is that we separate the contenders from the pretenders. And so along with that, we say that, look, there are basically 3 tickets out of Iowa. So if you finish in the top 3, you've got a pretty good chance. And we've winnowed the field. Now, sometimes somebody can come up fourth or fifth place, something like that. Of course, Democrats with Biden, where he finished fourth here and fifth in New Hampshire, but something happened down the road. But that was an open primary. And again, this year, or caucus, I guess it was primary in South Carolina. This year is odd because of Trump in the mix, and I'll get to that in a second. But at least in terms of sort of that difference, yeah, we had a number of people where Rick Santorum won the caucuses, Mike
Sure.
Huckabee won the caucuses. They both lost the nomination. Ted Cruz won the caucuses, didn't get the nomination. Now Trump did win in 20, but that was a year where he's running as an incumbent, so that
Yeah.
really doesn't count, kind of a thing.
Right.
And so, in that sense, that say, let's see, with Huckabee in the Santorum years, the Republican candidate lost in the general election. With Ted Cruz winning the caucuses but lost to Trump, Trump did win the election, though lost the popular vote. But aside from that, I mean, sometimes Republicans can say, well, yeah, but if Huckabee and Santorum had been the nominees, maybe they would have won. So, maybe the people down the line made a mistake. Anyway, the point is that by picking somebody, we sort of vet the candidates. And that's really a second major portion of the caucus. It's not just what happens on caucus night, but that whole process where Iowans get that opportunity via retail politics to vet those candidates and basically say, who's good, who has a good message, who can build out a campaign. And that's one of the advantages of starting in a small state like Iowa and New Hampshire, where you don't have to have a ton of money and name recognition to get a foothold. So if you started in California or Florida or Texas, it would take a lot more effort, a lot more name recognition and resources to be able to mount a viable campaign right from the get-go. Whereas here in Iowa, you can start real small. As long as your message is resonating, you build it out, you do that retail politics, everything that we expect folks to do, and maybe you can be successful. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily you're going to be successful down the road, especially on the Republican side. Democrats have actually been a little bit better at that in terms of who has won the Iowa caucuses, has ended up winning the general election, or the nomination and the general election. But that's really not our goal necessarily, especially again on the Republican side, to say, well, look, we're going to pick the people we think are the three most viable candidates, and here you go. And so to some extent, it's a matter of beating expectations as to how they do. So, if you were polling at first and end up third, that's going to hurt you, and you may be out of the mix pretty quickly. But on the other hand, if you were polling in fourth and end up second, maybe that's going to give you some momentum. You didn't win the caucuses, but maybe you've got something going into New Hampshire. So yes, we do our thing. We let people see what our decision was, and then you just move on to other states.
Hmm. Let me ask you a question, and this has to do with the long term for the Iowa caucus. As I said at the beginning of our discussion, it's always enjoyed its first in the nation status for a significant number of years now. And there are states and individual politicians. For example, you mentioned Joe Biden making the move to flip the order and take Iowa's first in the nation status away from it. Long term, do you see Iowa, both political parties, fiercely fighting for that very unique distinction? In other words, we set the tone for what's going to happen in a presidential election campaign, or is it going to be an issue where over time individual members of the parties aren't going to see the importance of what is unique to Iowa in this, and it's just going to be, well, and we had a nice run and there you go?
Yeah, as far as the Democrats are concerned, I think they've already abandoned Iowa. So that's a lost cause at this point. I think it would be very difficult for them, given the things that they seem to think are important, or at least the way that the party officials in Iowa seem to think are important. Now, maybe we'll find out if the mail-in ballot stuff doesn't work this time, then maybe they won't do it again in 2028 when they'll have an open caucus or primary or mail-in or however you want to term it for them. But I think it will be very hard for them to backtrack at this point. For the Republicans, hopefully they'll continue. And that's one of the reasons why Republicans wanted to put on a really good caucus this time with no mistakes and have everybody come and participate so that, in fact, it would be viable going forward in 2028. And again, if Trump ends up being the nominee, regardless of whether he or Biden wins, assuming Biden's the nominee, then 2028 would be an open primary for, or a caucus for Republicans and actually for Democrats too. So we'll sort of see what happens there. But there was some concern that with Governor Reynolds, she initially didn't endorse Trump. that her view was that I need to stay neutral because I want all of these candidates to come to Iowa and campaign. And again, that's partly to save the caucuses. If she had endorsed Trump early on and made it sort of, okay, Trump's the one, our favorite here, then probably we wouldn't have seen a number of these other candidates come to Iowa and do their campaigning here. They would have just written us off. Not unlike what happened for the Democrats back in 1992 when our then Senator Tom Harkin decided to run for president. He had no chance, but because he's the home state native son
Favorite
kind of a
son.
thing,
Yep.
basically all of the candidates put very little effort into Iowa. And so, Bill Clinton ended up getting the nomination that year, of course, but he hardly campaigned here at all. Harkin got something like 75% of the vote simply because he's the home state guy. So
Yep.
when you have a situation like that, then people aren't going to come here. And I think that was what was behind Reynolds' decision to not initially endorse Trump. And then, of course, she got criticized by Trump a lot, and that probably influenced her decision to ultimately endorse DeSantis. Now, I bring all of that up in part because if Trump then is unhappy with Iowa, he might do something like Biden did, which is to say, well, maybe Iowa shouldn't go first.
Mhm.
If he's looking to punish Reynolds or whatever it happens to be. So I'm a little concerned about that. On the other hand, my guess is that if Trump's the nominee, Iowa's going to go for him like it did in 2016 and 2020. And so as a result, maybe he'll be happy enough and be willing to still support Iowa's going first. But it's going to be tough, and especially with New Hampshire, as I said before, that Iowa and New Hampshire usually work together to keep the first status as the first caucus, first primary. And given that New Hampshire is going to be punished for continuing to go first for both the Republicans and Democrats, maybe they'll cave at some point, especially if Democrats take over their state house. Right now, Republicans control, so that makes it easier for Republicans to continue to say, okay, we're going to continue with the first primary, and Democrats basically have to go along with it. But if at some point Democrats gain the state office there, then maybe that state law will change, and then Iowa may be abandoned. It's hard to say if the Iowa Republicans will continue. And again, even here in Iowa, as we were saying before, it's not a reliably red state like some others. We're on the red side of purple at this point. And at some point, that pendulum is going to swing back.
Yep.
And then if the Democrats control the state house and the state legislature, maybe they'll change it from a caucus to a primary or a mail-in ballot or something of that nature. So who knows? So yeah, we have to basically enjoy it and enjoy it while we've got it, because it's no guarantee that we'll have the caucuses as the first presidential selection process in the future.
Yeah, and to me, it's like there are way too many institutions, be they political or otherwise, that are just being tossed aside, and people don't realize there are reasons why those institutions have lasted as long as they have, and there are reasons why those institutions are good for the overall society. But that's a whole other discussion. I tell you what, in the remaining time we've got left, would you be willing to take maybe a couple of questions from out in the audience, just for
Sure.
folks who pop some things in? Let me start with Blue Streamer again. He asks, and I'm going to rephrase this just a very little bit, but you'll get the general idea. With regard to Vivek Ramaswamy, he's done any number of county events all over Iowa, but do you think, I mean, granted, the players are the players, and I'm not trying to speak ill of anyone who's supporting any one candidate, but do you think that given how much retail groundwork he's done in Iowa, that he's got a better than average shot, or is it just because maybe of his lack of name recognition at this point, he's not going to do as well as other candidates might?
Vivek is an interesting situation. He has done a huge number of events, been to all of the counties, I think, and I think you mentioned before, even multiple times. So he's put in the work. But as I said before, putting in the work isn't necessarily going to guarantee success. And Vivek had a moment early on with after what was it, the first debate, I think, that he kind of came out. Nobody knew who he was, but he came out
Right.
swinging, was saying a lot of stuff, and he got a lot of attention, and he jumped in the polls a little bit as a result of it. I don't know where he was or where he had been, but
Sure.
basically it was a several point jump. And then, of course, since then he's continued to particularly attack Haley, but supporting especially the debate where he really complimented Trump, and people started asking, well, if you're that complimentary of Trump, why are you running against him? So it didn't seem that he really had a good reason for his candidacy other than maybe to raise his profile. And we see that a lot here in Iowa, where there are a lot of people we say, especially early on, that are running for president that aren't really running for president or don't have a shot. So they're maybe looking for a vice presidential slot, they're looking for a cabinet slot, or just to raise their profile for something down the road, maybe the next election cycle, something like that. So that's not entirely surprising. What motivates Vivek, I don't know. But at least he's getting his name out there. He also raises some issues. Sometimes candidates want to raise a particular issue. So Christie, of course, his main reason is just to attack Trump. So is Asa Hutchinson at this point. They're not really doing much other than that. With Vivek, he's raising certain issues. He talks about things that he thinks are important. So in a sense, that's not a bad thing to have somebody out there, even for a candidate that's not necessarily got a serious chance of being the nominee or winning the caucuses, that if you're raising issues that the others aren't, and or raising them in a way that others aren't, sort of thinking about it in a different way. And so maybe that is one of the things as a younger candidate, thinking more for how younger generations might be thinking about this, particularly when it looks like the leaders in both parties are rather old, shall we say. I'm getting kind of in that age group myself, so I have to be careful how I phrase that. But basically, that's kind of where Vivek is. So he's done the work. He's got his message out there. People are probably thinking about it. And, the other candidates probably have to respond to things he said on these other issues. Certainly, Haley has in a variety of ways. But does he have a shot? No.
Yeah. Yeah, well, true that. On the Rumble side, we have Francis Montgomery asking a question about colleges and universities in Iowa. Are colleges in Iowa as liberal as in other parts of the country? Now, that's a fairly interesting question because Iowa has, regardless of your political affiliation, at least this has been my observation, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, Iowa has a fairly even-handed, commonsensical view of the world. Does that translate into its universities or the maybe not necessarily the instruction? I'm trying to figure out how I want to say this, but the way that universities in Iowa approach education.
Yeah, it's a mixed bag, as you would probably imagine. We're certainly not as bad as Harvard or some
Oh
of these other
Lord.
places that are under attack right now. But, we have DEI officials in various sorts. There were some things on Twitter today talking about the number of DEI folks at the University of Michigan, which I'm always open to criticism of the University of Michigan. Congratulations to them on the national championship. But as a Michigan State grad, I'm always difficult to praise Michigan for pretty much anything else. But they've got a huge number of people on their payroll for these positions that really aren't really pushing forward the academic side of things. It's all, this ideology of diversity, equity, and inclusion kinds of things, which is what used to be affirmative action, but now it's more than that sort of stuff. So that stuff happens on campus, at least my campus, to a certain extent, but not to the extent that we seem to see it in some other places as well. And I think that it will depend on more individuals. And one of the things that I often tell folks is that as far as the students are concerned, that even though people think, well, young people, they're all liberals kind of a thing, and they're not. I can tell you that. But and the reason for that is that the students at the University of Iowa, and this is going to be true of Iowa State University as well, is that they come from all across Iowa. So they're coming from maybe the more liberal portions, but the more conservative portions as well. Plus a lot of out-of-state students. We have a lot of students from Illinois here too. And so as a result, the students are often, it's a much more mixed than maybe the faculty are. In terms of the faculty, yeah, they're probably heavily liberal, not probably, they are, but they may be not as extreme in some of their positions as we see coming out of some other colleges. There are going to be individuals that do some of that stuff, but by and large, even though it is a fairly liberal campus, I haven't seen that extreme stuff that we see coming out of some other places. And as far as the students are concerned, a lot of times, especially the conservatives, they'll just kind of keep their head low. Every once in a while, you'll get, some professor that will spout off about some political stuff. And I've heard this, as far back as 2000 with George W. Bush, and some biology professor just went off on how terrible Bush is. And I'm thinking, what's this got to do with biology? But a lot of times, again, the conservative students will just sort of, keep quiet, keep their head low, try to stay out of it, stay out of the political stuff if they think it's going to hurt them. Whereas, a few other people will engage in various ways. I had a former student that ended up at the law school here, and he had a very liberal professor, but that very liberal professor liked my student who was very conservative because that student would engage with him, whereas other students didn't, kind of a thing. And so, and he didn't punish the student for being a conservative. And so you do get some professors along those lines as well. And so, like I say, it's kind of a mixed bag. It's certainly not as bad as it is in some other universities.
Well, that's good to hear. And now, one last question from the audience. Then I'm going to ask you a question. Then we'll wrap it up because I know there's a understandable time constraint, particularly because you got to shovel your way out of what you're being buried under right now. From Blue Streamer again, he asks, "What is it that causes people in purple areas to change voting patterns in such a short time? Have their positions really changed, or have they lost sentimentality for their previous party's affiliation?" That's a good question.
It is. So let me talk for a second about what the situation is here in Iowa. For many years, we basically had the voter registration in Iowa divided a third, a third, a third between Republicans, Democrats, and independents, which we call
Sure.
no party voters here in Iowa. And the no party voters had a plurality all up until the primary in 2020. And that was that was the pandemic primary that the Secretary of State and other officials decided to send out a mail-in ballot on the primary to everybody. And a lot of the no party voters didn't understand that if they wanted to participate in the Republican or Democratic primaries, that meant that their voter registration would change. And so that sort of created an earthquake in terms of sort of the distribution. But even though Republicans have a voter registration advantage over Democrats, and Democrats a little bit over no party right now, it's still pretty close to a third, a third, a third. Now, the reason I mention that is because that group in the middle, the no party voters, they're the ones that determine how the state goes in statewide elections, and usually in congressional elections and a lot of state legislative elections as well. And they're the ones, and partly because why there's no party voters, that they don't care about that party infighting stuff. They're concerned more about the traditional kitchen table issues, jobs, the economy, healthcare, and now kids and schools has entered that as well. And so they just want to know, how are you going to help me? And so that's
Sure.
what really varies, is how are you convincing those middle voters? And this is no surprise. This is usually how it works in general elections too. And so is what you're saying resonating with them? And so those issues will change a little bit over time. If you have a situation where you have a relatively good economy, then maybe the focus is on some other issues. This time the economy is probably going to be pretty important, as it was in some past elections. You think in particular, I'm old enough to remember the 1980 election with Jimmy Carter as the president, that the economy was toast, high interest rates, stagflation, all kinds of terrible things. And basically Carter, by everybody's account, is a nice guy, but he just was presiding over a horrible economy, and he's going
Yeah.
to lose big, which he did to Ronald Reagan. So if you have something like that, or it could be foreign stuff, although that doesn't usually affect it as much. But of course, this time we've got things going on in Ukraine and Israel that are of interest to people, plus things on the border. So those are the things that you have to reach out to those middle voters. That for any candidate who's a Democrat or Republican, you're probably going to get most of your base, 80-90% of your base anyway. And so you have to make sure you're talking to that middle group. And those are the folks that are the true swing voters. They're not tied any kind of allegiance to one party or the other. They'll look for a particular candidate who's resonates with them, who's saying the right things, who's saying the things that they care about in terms of those issues. And that's how we end up with a purple state.
Sure. Well, this is not a question, but I thought you would appreciate this because it's a nice compliment from someone in our audience for you. Professor Hagle is youthful and spry, bride in this ancient crusty. So there you go. One last question. I promise I'll let you go. All right. So for people who are going to be watching this caucus next Monday night, if they want to see the results of what's going on, what is the best place for them to go to?
My understanding is that the Iowa GOP website is going to have the results. And again, the way I understand it is that as the precincts are reporting, individual precincts are reporting the results, that they will be shown on this website. So they're not going to wait for the complete total. They're not going to wait for a county by county kind of a thing. That, like in a general election, you'll see partial counts. That's how I understand it. They're still testing the system to make sure that it can't be hacked, that it's going to work properly,
Sure.
especially when there's this crush of people reporting all around 8:30, 9 o'clock kind of time period. So I'm not sure if that website, the Iowa GOP will direct you somewhere else. You can probably do a search on Google or something of that nature and find the Iowa Republican Party and find their website. And then from there, if it's not on that specific website, there ought to be a link to where the results are going to be reported.
Okay, very good. Well, Professor Hagle, I want to thank you for coming on the Electronic Front Porch. This has been a really interesting conversation. I'm trying as much as I can this year in each state, etc., to give viewers of my channel as much information as they can possibly get, to get some background for some feel for what's going on. And this is going to be a fascinating year politically. If people enjoy watching American politics, it's good and bad. This is going to be an amazing year for it. So thank you for coming on, folks. For everybody who's out there in the audience, be it on YouTube, Rumble, Twitter, wherever you are, thanks for stopping by. We're going to be back tomorrow night on my channel, reviewing the live stream reviewing the Donald Trump town hall appearance on Fox News with Brett Baer and Martha McCallum. Professor Hagle, hang around for 1 second. We'll say some proper goodbyes. Folks, thank you very much for stopping by, and we'll see you next time.